The Titanic has offered an unprecedented insight into the ship's final moments. A detailed three-dimensional reconstruction.
Why'd you do that, huh? You're so stupid, Rose. Why did you do that? Why?
Of the wreck reveals engineers worked to keep the lights on even as the vessel sank.
The most famous love story ever put on film, but then you discover that the real people who lived through that nightmare were actually more incredible than any movie character could ever be. Today, we're going to meet the real passengers of the Titanic, and I promise you, their true stories will leave you speechless. You've seen Jack and Rose fall in love on the grand staircase. You've watched the ship split in two as that haunting music played. But what if I told you that the real Titanic carried people whose lives were so extraordinary, so heartbreaking, and so inspiring that Hollywood couldn't have invented them if they tried? What if the woman who inspired Rose was actually braver than the movie version? What if there were love stories on board that were more beautiful and more tragic than anything James Cameron ever dreamed up? Get ready to have your mind completely blown, because we're about to discover that reality was far more amazing than fiction. The real Titanic wasn't just a ship full of extras in a movie. It was home to real people with real dreams, real fears, and real love stories that will make you cry harder than you did watching Leonardo DiCaprio freeze in that water. Let's start with someone you think you know. Margaret Brown, who the movie calls the unsinkable Molly Brown. In James Cameron's film, she's this tough, no-nonsense woman who speaks her mind and doesn't take garbage from anyone. She's loud, she's bold, and she's absolutely fearless. But here's what the movie didn't tell you about the real Margaret Brown, and it's going to break your heart in the best way possible. The real Margaret wasn't just some wealthy woman who got lucky. She was a fighter from day one. Born into poverty, she married into money, but she never forgot where she came from. When she boarded the Titanic, she wasn't just taking a luxury cruise. She had rushed to Europe because her grandson was seriously sick, and she was racing back to America to be with her family. This woman dropped everything, bought a ticket on the first available ship, which happened to be the Titanic, because family meant everything to her. But here's where her story gets absolutely incredible. When that ship started sinking, Margaret didn't just save herself. She went from room to room, pounding on doors, waking up passengers who might have slept through the commotion. She helped people into lifeboats, and when she finally got into lifeboat number 6, she didn't just sit there quietly like some scared passenger. She took charge. The boat was supposed to hold 65 people, but the crew member in charge was so panicked that he only loaded 28 people into it. Margaret Brown looked around at that half-empty lifeboat and started yelling at him to go back for more people. When he refused, she threatened to throw him overboard herself. This woman was literally ready to fight to save more lives. She wrapped the freezing passengers in her own fur coat and helped row the boat through the freezing Atlantic for hours until rescue came. After she was rescued, did Margaret Brown go home and try to forget what happened? Absolutely not. She started a survivors committee right there on the rescue ship, and raised money to help the families of crew members who had died. She made sure that the poorest survivors got help finding places to stay and money to start over. The newspapers started calling her the unsinkable Molly Brown, and the nickname stuck, because she truly was unsinkable. Nothing could keep this woman down. Now let's talk about someone the movie barely mentioned, but whose story is so beautiful it could be its own 3-hour epic. Meet Isidore and Ida Strauss. In the movie, you might remember them as the elderly couple who chose to stay in bed together as the ship sank, holding hands as the water rushed in. That scene lasted maybe 2 minutes, but their real story deserves so much more. Isidore Strauss owned Macy's department store, making him one of the richest men in America. He and Ida had been married for over 40 years, and they were still completely devoted to each other. They did everything together. When Isidore had to travel for business, Ida went with him. When she wanted to visit family in Europe, he came along. They were each other's best friends, lovers, and constant companions for 4 decades. On the night the Titanic sank, Isidore helped load women and children into lifeboats. When it came time for Ida to get into a boat, she looked at her husband and said something that still makes people cry more than a century later. She said, "Where you go, I go. We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I will go." The crew members begged her to get in the lifeboat. Other passengers pleaded with her. But Ida Strauss looked at the man she had loved for most of her life and said, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die together." They gave Ida's life jacket to her maid and made sure she got safely into a lifeboat. Then Isidore and Ida found chairs on the deck, sat down together, and held hands as the greatest ship in the world sank beneath them. Witnesses said they never let go of each other. They died as they had lived for 40 years, side by side, completely devoted to each other. When their bodies were recovered, Isidore's was buried in New York, but Ida's was never found. She's still out there in the Atlantic, and somehow that feels exactly right for a woman who refused to be separated from her husband even by death. But let's talk about some people the movie got completely wrong, starting with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews. In the film, he's shown as this guilt-ridden man, who basically gives up when he realizes his ship is doomed. He's standing in the smoking room, looking defeated, waiting to go down with his creation. But the real Thomas Andrews was nothing like that passive character. The real Thomas Andrews was only 39 years old, and he was absolutely brilliant. He had been designing ships since he was a teenager, and the Titanic was his masterpiece. When the ship hit that iceberg, Andrews didn't stand around feeling sorry for himself. He became a one-man rescue operation. He ran through the ship, calculating exactly how long they had before it sank. He personally went to passenger cabins, helping people put on life jackets, and showing them the fastest routes to the lifeboats. Passengers remember seeing this calm, determined man moving through the chaos, helping everyone he could. He made sure the mail clerks knew to abandon their posts when the water reached a certain level. He told the band where to position themselves to keep passengers calm. He worked with the crew to make sure the distress rockets were fired properly. Thomas Andrews spent his last hours on Earth trying to save as many people as possible, and witnesses say he was still helping passengers when the ship made its final plunge. This wasn't a man who gave up. This was a hero who fought to save lives until the very last second. Now, let's meet some people James Cameron never told you about, starting with the Titanic's postal workers. Yes, the ship had a post office, and 5 brave men worked there. When the ship started flooding, these postal workers didn't abandon their posts to save themselves. They worked desperately to move 200,000 pieces of mail to higher decks, hoping to save letters and packages that people were counting on. They worked in water up to their knees, then up to their waists, moving bag after bag of mail to safety. All 5 postal workers died that night, but they kept working until the water made it impossible. Families back home were waiting for birthday cards, love letters, business documents, and packages that meant the world to them. These 5 men died trying to make sure those precious pieces of mail would make it home. Their names were Oscar Woody, William Gwynne, John Smith, James Campbell, and John March. They deserve to be remembered as heroes. Here's another story that will absolutely destroy you. The Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were both very young men. Jack was 25 and Harold was only 22. When the ship hit the iceberg, these 2 men became the ship's lifeline to the outside world. They sent out distress call AF. To distress call, trying to reach any ship that could help. Jack Phillips stayed at his wireless equipment even as the ship was sinking. He kept sending SOS signals while the ship tilted more and more, while the power flickered on and off, while chaos erupted all around him. Harold Bride tried to get him to abandon his post and save himself, but Jack refused to stop. He kept working, knowing that his signals might be the only thing standing between 2,200 people and certain death. Jack Phillips died that night, still trying to save lives. But Harold Bride survived, and here's the incredible part. After he was pulled from the water, barely alive, with frostbitten feet and severe injuries, the first thing he did was ask if Jack had made it. When he learned that his friend and partner had died, Harold Bride broke down crying. These weren't just co-workers. They were young men who had become friends, working together in a tiny wireless room, and Jack had literally died trying to save everyone on that ship. But let's talk about some passengers, whose stories are so incredible that Hollywood would never believe them. Meet the Countess of Roths, whose real name was Lucy Noel Martha Dyer Edwards. In real life, she was traveling back to America with her cousin and her maid. She was elegant, she was wealthy, and she was absolutely fearless. When the Countess got into lifeboat number 8, she didn't just sit there like some helpless aristocrat. She took an oar and rowed for hours through the freezing night. But here's the amazing part. The seaman in charge of their lifeboat was so overwhelmed and frightened that he basically fell apart. So this elegant countess, who probably had never done a day of manual labor in her life, took charge of the entire boat. She organized the other women, kept everyone calm, and made sure they rowed in the right direction toward the rescue ship. When they were finally picked up, the seaman was so grateful that he gave the Countess his life jacket as a thank you gift. He told her she had been the real captain of their lifeboat. This wasn't some helpless, rich woman waiting to be saved. This was a leader who saved herself and everyone else in that boat. Now let's talk about the children on board, because their stories will break your heart, and then put it back together again. The movie barely showed any children, but there were actually many kids on the Titanic, and their stories are incredible. Meet the Navratil boys, Michelle and Edmund, ages 4 and 2. Their father had kidnapped them from their mother in France, and was taking them to America to start a new life. When the ship started sinking, their father knew he probably wouldn't survive, so he made sure his little boys got into a lifeboat. But here's the heartbreaking part. The boys only spoke French, and no one on the rescue ship could figure out who they were or where they belonged. The newspapers called them the Titanic Orphans, and their pictures were published all over the world. Their mother in France saw the photos and recognized her babies. She traveled to New York to get them, and there's actually film footage of their reunion. You can watch this mother seeing her children again, after thinking they were dead, and it's one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. Those little boys grew up and lived full lives, but they never forgot the night their father made sure they survived even though he couldn't. Then there's Milvina Dean, who was only 2 months old when she sailed on the Titanic. She was the youngest passenger on board, traveling with her parents and older brother to start a new life in America. When the ship sank, her father put baby Milvina, her mother, and her brother into a lifeboat. He stayed behind and died, but his sacrifice saved his family. Milvina grew up to become the last living Titanic survivor. She lived to be 97 years old, and she spent her whole life talking about the Titanic and honoring the memory of everyone who died that night, including her father. She said she didn't remember the sinking, of course, but she remembered her mother's stories, and she made sure the world never forgot what happened. When Milvina died in 2009, she was the last person on Earth who had actually been on that ship, and with her death, the Titanic's last connection to living memory was gone. But here's one more story that's going to absolutely amaze you. There was a man on board named Colonel Archibald Gracie, and his survival story reads like an action movie. When the ship was sinking, Colonel Gracie helped load women and children into lifeboats. He stayed on the ship until the very last possible second, and when the ship finally went down, he was literally sucked underwater along with it. Most people who got pulled down with the ship died, but somehow Colonel Gracie fought his way back to the surface. He managed to grab onto an overturned lifeboat, where about 30 other men were clinging to life in the freezing water. They balanced on this upside-down boat for hours, taking turns standing up to keep it from flipping over completely. Colonel Gracie said later that he had never been so cold in his entire life. Men around him were dying from hypothermia, slipping off the boat and disappearing into the black water. But he held on, and when rescue finally came, he was one of the few men pulled alive from that overturned boat. He lived to tell his story, and he wrote one of the most detailed accounts of the sinking that we have today. Now, let's talk about what the movie got wrong about social class, because this is important. James Cameron's film shows a pretty clear divide between rich and poor passengers, with the wealthy people being mostly selfish, and the poor people being noble and good-hearted. But the reality was much more complicated and much more interesting. Yes, there were some wealthy passengers who acted terribly that night. But there were also rich people who were incredibly brave and generous. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the richest men on the ship, helped load lifeboats and then went back to his cabin to put on his finest evening wear. He told people, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He and his valet were last seen sitting in the first-class lounge, having a brandy and waiting calmly for the end. On the other hand, there were poor passengers who fought desperately to save themselves, sometimes pushing others aside. There were third-class passengers who helped each other and shared what little they had, and there were others who panicked and acted selfishly. The real story isn't about rich people being bad and poor people being good. It's about how some people, regardless of their bank account, showed incredible courage and kindness in the face of death, while others were overwhelmed by fear. What the movie did get right was showing how the ship's crew, many of whom were working-class men, acted with incredible bravery. The band really did keep playing as the ship sank, trying to keep passengers calm. The engineers really did stay at their posts, keeping the power running and the lights on as long as possible so people could see to get to the lifeboats. These men knew they were going to die, but they kept working so others could live. Captain Edward Smith, who James Cameron portrayed as a defeated old man, was actually much more complex. Yes, he made some terrible decisions that night, including going too fast through an ice field and not taking ice warnings seriously enough. But when disaster struck, he worked tirelessly to save as many people as possible. He personally helped load lifeboats, and he made sure the wireless operators kept sending distress calls. He went down with his ship, which was expected of captains in those days, but he spent his last hours trying to save his passengers. Here's something else the movie didn't show you. The Titanic carried people from all over the world, and their diverse stories make the disaster even more heartbreaking. There were Lebanese families moving to America for better opportunities. There were Irish farmers hoping to buy land. There were Swedish immigrants dreaming of new lives. There were Chinese sailors working their way across the ocean. One of the most touching stories involves a group of Finnish passengers who were traveling together to start a religious community in America. They held hands and prayed together as the ship sank, singing hymns in their native language. Survivors remembered hearing their voices carrying across the water even as the ship went down. There were also some absolutely wild survival stories that sound too crazy to be true. Take Charles Lightoller, the ship's second officer. This man had already lived an incredible life before he ever set foot on the Titanic. He had been a cowboy in Canada, a gold prospector in Alaska, and a sailor all over the world. When the Titanic sank, he was literally sucked down with the ship, just like Colonel Gracie, but Lightoller was thrown clear when an underwater explosion blew him back to the surface. He managed to climb onto the same overturned lifeboat as Colonel Gracie, and he took charge of the men clinging to it. He organized them into a system where they would all lean in the same direction to keep the boat balanced, and he kept their spirits up through that terrible night. He survived, and he went on to serve in both World Wars. During World War II, when he was 66 years old, he took his own small boat across the English Channel to help rescue British soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. This man was basically indestructible, But here's what really gets me about the Titanic story, and what I think James Cameron's movie missed. It wasn't just about the people who died or the people who survived. It's about what happened after. The sinking of the Titanic changed everything about how we think about safety, about technology, and about taking care of each other. Before the Titanic, people believed that technology could solve any problem. The ship was called unsinkable, and people actually believed that human engineering had conquered the ocean. The disaster shattered that confidence and made people realize that nature is still more powerful than anything we can build. The sinking also led to major changes in maritime law. Ships now have to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radio operators have to monitor distress frequencies 24 hours a day. There are international ice patrol services that track icebergs and warn ships. All of these changes came about because 1,500 people died on a cold April night in 1912. But maybe most importantly, the Titanic disaster showed the world both the worst and the best of human nature. Yes, there was panic and selfishness and terrible mistakes. But there was also incredible courage, love, and sacrifice. There were people who gave their lives for strangers, who chose love over safety, who worked to save others even when they knew they were going to die. The real passengers of the Titanic weren't just characters in someone else's story. They were real people with real dreams, real fears, and real love for their families and friends. Margaret Brown wasn't just unsinkable because she survived. She was unsinkable because she refused to let tragedy defeat her spirit. Isidore and Ida Strauss weren't just a sweet old couple. They were two people who loved each other so much that they chose to face death together rather than live apart. Thomas Andrews wasn't a man who gave up when his ship failed. He was a hero who spent his last hours on Earth trying to save as many people as possible. The postal workers weren't just doing their jobs. They were trying to make sure that love letters and birthday cards would make it home to the people who needed them. Every person on that ship had a story. Every person who died that night left behind people who loved them. Every survivor carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. The Titanic wasn't just a ship that sank. It was home to 2,200 individual human stories, each one as complex and important as the main characters in any movie. James Cameron's Titanic is an incredible film, and it introduced millions of people to this story. But the real story is even more amazing than anything Hollywood could create. The real people were braver, more complex, more heartbreaking, and more inspiring than any fictional characters could ever be. So the next time you watch that movie, remember that behind every extra in the background, there was a real person with a real story. Remember Margaret Brown fighting to save more lives. Remember Isidore and Ida Strauss choosing love over life. Remember Thomas Andrews working until the very end. Remember the postal workers trying to save the mail. Remember the wireless operators sending out distress calls. Remember all the ordinary people who did extraordinary things on the worst night of their lives. The Titanic's real legacy isn't the movie, or the books, or the documentaries. It's the reminder that every human life has value, that love is stronger than death, and that even in the darkest moments, people are capable of incredible courage and kindness. That's a story worth telling, retelling, and never forgetting. If this video opened your eyes to the incredible real stories behind the Titanic, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. These real people and their amazing stories deserve to be remembered and honored. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that are even more fascinating than fiction, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. The real world is full of heroes whose stories are waiting to be told, and we're here to make sure they are never forgotten.